They say a house is just four walls and a roof. But they're wrong. A house is a storybook, written in scuff marks on the floorboards and pencil lines on a doorframe. My little blue house on Sycamore Street wasn't just a building, it was my life's manuscript. And my children, my own children, the characters I had written onto every page, decided to rip out the ending and write their own. They thought the story was over. They didn't realize I was the one holding the pen. There's a unique kind of pain that comes from being betrayed by your own blood. It's a quiet poison, one that makes you question not just them, but yourself. If you've ever felt that sting, that feeling of being completely and utterly underestimated by the people who should know you best, then you know what I'm talking about. Stick with me through this story, because it's a long and winding road. And if you find a piece of your own story in mine, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It lets me know I'm not the only one out there who believes that sometimes, the only way to heal is to make sure the people who hurt you finally understand the lesson. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Part 1, The Foundation of Lies. The smell of my house was the first thing you'd notice. It was a mixture of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet perfume of the climbing roses my husband Robert planted for me on our 10th anniversary. The bushes were gnarled and thick now, like old men's knuckles, but they still produced the most beautiful, deep red blooms every June. On quiet mornings, I'd sit on the porch swing he built, a cup of coffee warming my hands, and I could almost feel him there with me, his comfortable silence settling beside me like a well-worn blanket. We bought the house when I was 25 and pregnant with Daniel. It was a fixer-upper, a term that real estate agents use to mean a pile of problems held together by nostalgia. But we saw the potential. Robert was a carpenter by trade, a magician with wood, and I had a vision. We spent every weekend for a year stripping wallpaper, sanding floors until our arms ached, and painting walls late into the night, fueled by cheap pizza and the intoxicating promise of our future. This house wasn't just built with wood and nails. It was built with our laughter, our arguments, our sweat, and our dreams. The tiny scratch on the guest room window was from the Christmas Daniel got his first BB gun and swore he saw a squirrel wearing a tiny hat. The faint, almost invisible water stain on the kitchen ceiling was from the time a 10-year-old Lisa tried to build a baking soda volcano that was a little too enthusiastic. The notches on the kitchen doorway, charting their growth from toddlers to teenagers who stooped to get through, were like rings on a tree. Our family's tree. After Robert passed away 5 years ago, the house became my anchor. Its creaks and groans were familiar voices. Its silence was a comfort, filled with 40 years of memories. At 65, my life was simple, and I liked it that way. My pension was enough. Robert had left me a small but secure savings account, and my needs were few. All I wanted was to live out my days in the sanctuary we had built, watering my roses and watching the neighborhood kids play. But my children, it seemed, had outgrown the storybook. It started with Daniel. He was 40 now, with a life that looked perfect on paper. He was a financial consultant, a vague title that seemed to involve expensive suits, a German car he couldn't quite afford, and a constant, low-level anxiety that flickered behind his eyes. He married a woman named Stephanie who judged my home with a single, sweeping glance every time she was forced to visit for a holiday. "Mom," he began one Sunday afternoon, leaning against the kitchen counter I'd watched him do his homework on for years. He used his special voice, the one that was smooth and round and designed to make you agree with him before you'd even processed the words. "We've been thinking. This is a lot of house for one person." I was washing dishes, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water. "It's the perfect amount of house for me, Daniel. It fits me just right." "But the upkeep," he pressed on, ignoring me. "The roof, the plumbing. You shouldn't have to worry about all that. We could sell it. You'd make a fortune in this market. You could get a lovely little condo. No yard work, a security guard at the front desk. You'd be safe. Comfortable." The word comfortable felt like an insult. I was comfortable. The knot in the wood on the third stair, which I'd learned to avoid in the dark, was comfortable. The way the afternoon sun slanted through the living room window and hit Robert's empty armchair was comfortable. A sterile, beige box in a building full of strangers was the opposite of comfort. "This house is paid for, Daniel," I said, my voice a little firmer than I intended. "It's mine. I'm not going anywhere." He sighed, A puff of condescending air. Just think about it, Mom. We're only thinking of you. I knew, even then, he was thinking of himself. He saw the house not as a home, but as an asset. A pile of money locked away in wood and brick that he felt entitled to. A week later, Lisa joined the chorus. Lisa was 37, and she had a habit of making her problems everyone else's crisis. She'd married her high school sweetheart, a man named Gary who was kind but perpetually overwhelmed by Lisa's ambitions. They had 2 children and a mortgage on a new-built house in a sprawling suburb that was twice the size of mine and had half the soul. She called me while she was in the car, the sounds of her kids squabbling in the background. "Mom, I was talking to Daniel," she began, her voice strained. "He told me you were being a little stubborn about the house." "He told you I don't want to sell my home," I corrected her. "But Mom, you have to be reasonable," she whined, and I could picture her perfectly, one hand on the steering wheel, the other gesturing dramatically to an empty passenger seat. "It's a crumbling old house. You can't keep up with it forever. Think of the money. We could finally be secure. We could pay off our debts, maybe take a real vacation. We could use that money, Mom. All of us." We. There was that word again. A word that was supposed to mean family, unity. But coming from them, it felt like a weapon. They weren't talking about we. They were talking about a pie, and they were annoyed that I was still sitting on it. "Lisa, this house is everything your father and I worked for," I said, my stomach tightening. "It's not a bank account. It's my home. It's an investment," she snapped, the frustration finally breaking through her practiced concern. "And it's just sitting there. You're being selfish." The line went quiet for a moment, the word hanging in the air between us. Selfish. For wanting to keep the only thing I had left of her father. For wanting to live in the home where I had raised her. The call ended soon after with a clipped, cold goodbye. The weeks that followed were a cold war fought with silence and pointed remarks. Daniel would send me listings for drab, depressing apartments under the subject line, "Just an idea." Lisa would call and complain about a sudden, unexpected bill, her meaning as subtle as a sledgehammer. They were trying to wear me down, to make me feel like a burden, a foolish old woman clinging to sentiment while the real world of money and practicality passed her by. I tried to ignore it. I patched a small leak in the gutter myself, feeling a surge of pride. I replanted the petunias in the front flower bed. I lived in my house, really lived in it, trying to soak up the peace they were so determined to shatter. I thought that if I was firm enough, they would eventually give up. I believed, foolishly, that there was a line they would not cross. I discovered that line on a Tuesday morning in late September. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the maple tree in the front yard were just beginning to turn a fiery red. I was enjoying my second cup of coffee on the porch swing when a sleek, silver car pulled up to the curb. A man in a suit I could never afford got out, holding a clipboard. He walked up my front path with an air of ownership that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Good morning," he said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Margaret Collins." "I am," I said, not getting up from the swing. "Great. I'm Mark from Prestige Realty. I'm just here a little early for the 2 o'clock viewing. Wanted to get a feel for the place, maybe put up the sign." He gestured to a large for sale sign leaning against his car. The coffee cup trembled in my hand. The world seemed to tilt slightly, the familiar view of my street suddenly looking strange and distorted. "Viewing? I think you have the wrong house. My house isn't for sale." Mark frowned, flipping a page on his clipboard. "Blue House, 124 Sycamore Street. Listed by Daniel and Lisa Collins. I spoke with Daniel this morning to confirm." My blood ran cold. It felt like plunging my hands into a bucket of ice water. Daniel and Lisa Collins. "Yes, ma'am. Your children, I presume? They're handling the sale for you. Said you were ready to downsize and didn't want to be bothered with the details." He gave me another one of those empty smiles. "It's great you have kids who look after you like that." I couldn't breathe. The air was thick and heavy in my lungs. I must have looked as horrified as I felt, because his professional demeanor faltered. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Collins?" A problem. He was asking if there was a problem. My children were selling my life out from under me, forging my name, lying to strangers, and he was asking if there was a problem. I don't remember what I said to him. I think I just shook my head, a slow, numb motion, and stumbled back inside, shutting the door behind me. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone. I called Daniel first. It went straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Daniel Collins. Leave a message." The cheerful, professional voice was a mockery. I called Lisa. Same thing. Voicemail. The panic was a living thing inside my chest, clawing at my ribs. I threw on a coat over my house dress, grabbed my purse, and drove to the county records office. My mind was a whirlwind of denial. It had to be a mistake. A misunderstanding. A colossal, terrible error. But it wasn't. The clerk at the records office was a young woman with kind eyes who probably dealt with mundane property deeds all day. But she saw the terror on my face and took her time, pulling up the file for my property. She turned the monitor toward me. And there it was. A multiple listing service agreement. An authorization to sell. All the official paperwork, filed just 2 weeks prior. And at the bottom of each page, a signature. Margaret Collins. It was my name, but it wasn't my hand. The slant was wrong, the M too sharp, the S at the end trailing off with a flourish I never used. It was a clumsy, arrogant forgery. A child's attempt at copying a parent's handwriting. They hadn't even tried very hard. They had assumed I would never find out. They had assumed that by the time I did, the house would be sold, the money would be in their accounts, and I would be tucked away in some sad little apartment, too old and confused to fight back. I stared at the screen, at the cold, black and white proof of their betrayal. The clerk was saying something, asking if I was okay. I couldn't answer. The sound in my ears was like a rushing wind. In that sterile government office, under the flat, humming fluorescent lights, my heart didn't just break. It shattered into a million pieces. I drove home in a daze. The world outside my car windows was a blur of color and light. When I walked back into my little blue house, the smell of lemon polish and roses felt like a lie. The memories in every corner were suddenly tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of what my children had tried to do. I sank into Robert's armchair by the window, the worn fabric cool against my skin, and I finally let myself cry. I cried for my husband, for the life we had built. I cried for the children I had raised and the strangers they had become. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room floor, something else began to bubble up through the grief. It was hot and sharp and tasted like iron. It was rage. They had called me old. They had called me weak. They had treated me like a relic, a piece of furniture to be disposed of along with the house. They had made the single biggest mistake of their lives. They had forgotten who I was. I was the woman who had patched this roof in a thunderstorm, the woman who had rewired a lamp with her own 2 hands, the woman who had nursed them through fevers and held them after nightmares. I was my husband's wife. I was a survivor. And I was not going to let them erase me. That night, sitting alone in the gathering dark, I made a promise to Robert, to the house, and to myself. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They thought they were closing a chapter, but all they had done was awaken a dragon. And they were about to get burned. Part 2, The Weight of Silence. The days that followed the discovery were a thick, suffocating fog. I moved through my house like a ghost, the familiar rooms suddenly feeling alien and hostile. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an accusation. The cheerful ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had been a constant, soothing rhythm my entire adult life, now felt like a countdown to a future I no longer recognized. Sleep offered no escape. It was a battlefield of nightmares where I would be screaming voiceless, as strangers carried my furniture out onto the lawn. I'd wake up with my heart pounding against my ribs, the sheets damp with a cold sweat, the silence of the house pressing in on me. My first coherent thought, once the initial shock subsided, was of Arthur. Arthur Pembroke had been Robert's best friend since childhood and my lawyer for the better part of 3 decades. He was a small, wiry man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a mind as sharp as a box cutter. He'd handled our will, the sale of Robert's old workshop, everything. He was retired now mostly, but I knew he'd see me. I called him, my voice trembling so much I could barely get the words out. He listened without interruption, a series of quiet grunts his only response. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Margaret," he finally said, and his voice was gravelly with a fury he was holding back on my behalf. "Stay put. Don't talk to them. Don't answer the door. I'll be there in an hour." When he arrived, I handed him the copies of the paperwork I'd gotten from the county office. He spread them out on my kitchen table, the same table where Daniel and Lisa had once finger-painted and spilled milk. He studied the forged signatures for a long time, his lips pressed into a thin, grim line. "This is an open and shut case of felony fraud, Margaret," he said, looking up at me over the rim of his glasses. "We can go to the police. We can press charges. They could face prison time." Prison. The word hung in the air, ugly and final. Daniel and Lisa. My children. In prison. For a moment, the thought was a flash of vicious, satisfying fire. Let them see what real walls felt like if they were so desperate to put me between new ones. But the fire died as quickly as it came, leaving behind nothing but cold ash. As much as they had hurt me, they were still my children. I didn't want to destroy their lives. I just wanted them to understand what they had tried to destroy of mine. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "No police. I don't want to ruin them, Arthur. I want it to stop. I want my house back. My life back." Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes full of a sad understanding. "All right. No police. But we fight this, and we fight it hard. We'll file an emergency injunction to halt any potential sale. We'll file an affidavit of forgery. We'll send a cease and desist to this Prestige Realty that will make their blood run cold. They won't be able to sell a doghouse, let alone your home, by the time I'm done with them." The legal battle was a blur of paperwork and anxious waiting. Arthur was a bulldog. He drafted letters that crackled with righteous indignation. The real estate agency, faced with a lawsuit that could cost them their license, dropped the listing like a hot coal and sent a stammering, apologetic letter. The injunction was granted. Legally, the house was safe. For now. The real confrontation came a few days later. They must have been notified by the lawyers. My phone rang, and it was Daniel. I stared at the screen, my heart thudding a painful, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I let it go to voicemail. Then Lisa called. I did the same. An hour later, Daniel's expensive German car screeched to a halt in my driveway. He stormed up the path, his face a mask of thunderous rage. He didn't even knock, just threw the front door open. "What the hell did you do?" he yelled, his voice echoing in the hall. I was standing in the living room, my hands clasped in front of me to keep them from shaking. I had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it in my head 100 times, but the sheer force of his entitlement still took my breath away. "I did what I had to do, Daniel," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I stopped you from stealing my home." "Stealing?" he scoffed, throwing his hands up in the air. "We were helping you. We were trying to secure your future. Our future. And you go and call a lawyer? You humiliate me like this." There it was. No apology. No remorse. No shame for what he'd done, only anger at being caught. His only concern was his own humiliation. Lisa arrived minutes later, looking like she'd been crying. But her tears were not of regret, they were tears of frustration. "Mom, how could you?" she sobbed, leaning against the doorframe for dramatic effect. "We were just trying to do what's best. That money would have changed our lives. Now Gary and we don't know what we're going to do." The two of them stood in my living room, the room where I had kissed their scraped knees and read them bedtime stories, and they painted themselves as the victims. They twisted their greed into concern, their theft into charity. They tried to gaslight me, telling me I was confused, that I must have agreed to it and forgotten, that my memory wasn't what it used to be. That was the moment the last, lingering ember of maternal softness in my heart turned to ice. "Get out," I said. The words were small, but they landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Daniel stared at me, his mouth agape. "What?" Get out of my house. I pointed to the door. Both of you. You tried to steal this house from me. You have no right to stand in it. You are not welcome here anymore. Their indignation turned to shock, then to a sputtering, defensive anger. They yelled, they accused, they pleaded. But I was a statue. A wall of ice they could not penetrate. I simply stood there waiting, until finally, defeated by my silence, they left, slamming the door behind them. The silence they left behind was different. It was no longer heavy and suffocating. It was clean, empty, but it was mine. I went through the house and took down their pictures. The family photo from our last Christmas together, their graduation pictures, the framed drawings they'd made me in elementary school. I packed them all carefully into a box and put it in the attic. It was a painful, gut-wrenching process. With each photo, I was mourning a memory, mourning the children I thought I had. But it was a necessary amputation. The wound was too deep, the limb too poisoned to be saved. I changed my phone number the next day. I cut them out of my life as cleanly and completely as a surgeon removing a tumor. The first few months were the hardest. The loneliness was a physical ache. Thanksgiving came and went, the house quiet and empty. Christmas was a long, silent day spent looking at the snow falling outside my window, my only company the ghosts of Christmases past. I would see mothers with their grown children in the grocery store, laughing together, and feel a pang so sharp it nearly brought me to my knees. There were moments of doubt, late at night, when I wondered if I had been too harsh. Had I overreacted? Was there a way to mend this? But then I would remember the cold, dead look in Daniel's eyes, the selfish whine in Lisa's voice, the ugly forgery of my name on a legal document. And the doubt would vanish, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I had not been harsh. I had been just. Slowly, I began to reclaim my life. I started volunteering at the local library, the smell of old books a comforting balm. I joined a gardening club, spending hours with women my own age who talked about soil acidity and heirloom tomatoes instead of interest rates and real estate markets. I reconnected with old friends. I started to build a new family, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not obligation and entitlement. And as my own life started to bloom again, I began to hear things. Whispers, through the grapevine of old family friends and distant relatives who hadn't yet been forced to choose a side. Daniel's consulting business wasn't just a mystery to me, it was a house of cards. He'd apparently sunk a huge amount of borrowed money into a speculative tech venture that had imploded, taking all his investors' money with it. He and Stephanie were living on credit cards and bravado, their perfect life a facade propped up by debt. Lisa and Gary were no better. The huge house they had bought was a financial albatross around their necks. They'd taken out an adjustable-rate mortgage, convinced their income would rise. It hadn't. Gary's company had downsized, and he'd taken a pay cut to keep his job. They were drowning, barely making the minimum payments on a mountain of debt, their lifestyle a performance for their equally overextended neighbors. The first time I heard a piece of this news, I felt a grim, dark flicker of satisfaction. But it wasn't joy. It was more like cosmic balance. A sense of the universe righting a terrible wrong. They had tried to liquidate my security to finance their recklessness. And now, their own recklessness was catching up to them. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year after I had kicked them out of my house, I was raking leaves in my front yard. An old neighbor of mine, Mary, who still lived a few streets over from Lisa, stopped her car to chat. After the usual pleasantries, she lowered her voice. "Margaret, I don't mean to gossip," she started, which always means the opposite, but I saw a notice taped to Lisa's front door the other day. It looked official. You know. I knew. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a stillness in the eye of a hurricane that had been raging for a year. I thanked Mary for the information, finished raking my leaves into neat piles, and went inside. That evening, I didn't sit in Robert's armchair. I sat at the kitchen table, the one where I had confronted the forged documents. I pulled out the old financial statements Arthur had helped me organize. My pension. My savings. And the investment account Robert had started for us decades ago, the one labeled for a rainy day. It had grown steadily, quietly over the years, a testament to his foresight and prudence. The rain, it seemed, was finally here. A new idea began to form in my mind. It wasn't a hot, angry impulse like the one I'd felt on the day of the discovery. This was different. It was cold, clear, and perfectly, precisely logical. They had taught me about assets and investments. They had taught me that a house was just a number on a balance sheet. Fine. I would take that lesson to heart. They had tried to take my storybook. Now I was going to buy theirs. And I was going to write a new ending they would never see coming. The dragon hadn't gone back to sleep. She had just been waiting. Part 3, a blueprint for payback. The decision, once it crystallized, was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. The grief, the rage, the year of wounded silence, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of purpose. I was no longer a victim reacting to a crisis. I was becoming an architect, drafting a blueprint for a very specific kind of justice. My first call, once again, was to Arthur. When I laid out the idea for him in his dusty, book-lined study, he took off his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief for a long, silent moment. I couldn't read his expression. "Margaret," he said finally, placing his glasses back on his nose. "This is unorthodox." "Is it illegal?" I asked. "No. Not in the slightest. Foreclosure auctions are public. Anyone with the capital can bid." He leaned forward, his elbows on his desk. "My only question is, are you sure about this? Becoming their landlord, that ties you to them again, just when you've finally cut the cord." "I'm not tying myself to my children, Arthur," I replied, and I was surprised by the steel in my own voice. "I'm tying them to their consequences. They see me as a resource to be drained. A foolish old woman. They need to see me as something else. Something they can't control, can't manipulate, and can't discard." A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. "Robert always said you were the toughest person he ever knew." I think he was right. From that day forward, my life had a new routine. My mornings were for my garden and my library volunteering. My afternoons were for research. Arthur helped me find a discreet but brilliant financial advisor, a woman named Ms. Albright, who specialized in asset management. She was all business, a sharp woman in her 40s who looked at my plan not as a family drama, but as a strategic acquisition. She treated me with a respect my own children had never shown, explaining everything from capital gains to escrow accounts with clarity and patience. Together, we reviewed Robert's legacy. That rainy day fund was more substantial than I'd realized. Robert, ever the planner, had invested wisely in low-risk bonds and blue-chip stocks. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Ms. Albright helped me liquidate a portion of it, moving the funds into a new account, ready and waiting. The process was empowering. For the first time, I wasn't just protecting what I had, I was actively wielding it. The next step was intelligence gathering, and for that, I turned to the most powerful and underestimated tool in the world, the county's public records website. It was a clunky, outdated system, but I spent hours teaching myself how to navigate it. I looked up Daniel's address first. The screen filled with liens. Liens from credit card companies, a lien from a materials supplier for his failed business, and finally the big one, a lease pendens filing. A formal notice of a pending foreclosure action from his bank. His house of cards was not just falling, it was being repossessed, one card at a time. Then I looked up Lisa. Her situation was simpler, but just as dire. A string of missed mortgage payments, followed by a notice of default. They were months behind. The bank was losing patience. I printed out the documents, the black ink stark against the white paper. I put them in a folder, a grim collection of my children's failures. I felt a cold satisfaction, but also a sliver of sorrow. This wasn't what any parent wants for their child. But it was what they had chosen. They had chosen the big house, the fancy car, the life of appearances over the foundation of prudence and hard work that Robert and I had tried to teach them. The waiting was the hardest part. Foreclosures are a slow, grinding process. Months passed. The leaves turned, fell, and the first snows of winter blanketed my garden. I went about my life, the secret knowledge of my plan a small, warm coal in my chest. There were moments of doubt. A flash of Lisa's face as a little girl, proudly showing me a drawing. A memory of Daniel, age 16, earnestly trying to help me fix a leaky faucet, getting more water on the floor than in the pipe. Were they truly lost to me? Was this revenge? Because let's call it what it was, truly the answer? The universe, it seems, has a way of answering such questions. One afternoon in early spring, I was at the grocery store when I saw Stephanie, Daniel's wife, in the checkout line ahead of me. She was dressed impeccably as always, but there was a frayed, brittle quality to her I'd never seen before. She was on her phone, her voice a low, vicious hiss. "I don't care what he said, Daniel, you fix it." The card was declined at the salon. Declined. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is? She swiped another card through the machine. It, too, was declined. Her face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. Leaving her full cart behind, she stormed out of the store. I watched her go, and any lingering doubt I had evaporated. They hadn't learned a thing. Their lives were still about appearances, about avoiding embarrassment, not about taking responsibility. My resolve hardened from steel into diamond. A few weeks later, the notices I had been waiting for appeared online. Auction dates. First for Daniel's house, then, 2 weeks later, for Lisa's. The properties would be sold on the steps of the county courthouse to the highest bidder. I practiced. Arthur, bless his heart, ran mock auctions for me in his office. He played the part of the fast-talking auctioneer while I practiced keeping my bidding paddle steady, my voice calm, my face a mask of detached indifference. "You can't show emotion, Margaret," he'd advise. "The other bidders are sharks. If they smell blood or desperation, they'll drive the price up just for sport. You are a calm, dispassionate investor making a sound financial decision. Nothing more." The night before Daniel's auction, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my dark living room, staring out at the quiet street. I thought about the day he was born, the impossible weight and warmth of him in my arms. I thought about the son who had looked at me with such rage and called my prudence selfishness. This wasn't just about buying a house. It was about taking back the narrative. He had tried to declare me irrelevant, to end my story. Tomorrow, I would become the most relevant person in his life. The day of the auction was gray and overcast, the sky the color of slate. I dressed carefully, not in my Sunday best, but in a simple, neat pantsuit. I wanted to look anonymous, professional, invisible. I drove to the courthouse and registered, receiving a bidding number on a small piece of laminated cardstock. Number 7. There were about a dozen other people there. Most looked like seasoned investors, with tired eyes and cheap leather briefcases. They eyed each other, and me, with suspicion. I found a spot at the back of the small crowd, leaning against a stone pillar, and I waited. Daniel's house was the third one on the docket. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a cheap suit, read out the address and the legal description. A 4-bedroom, 3-bath colonial in the desirable Northgate Highlands subdivision. He rattled off the opening bid. A few of the investors put in early bids, going back and forth in small increments. I stayed silent, my heart hammering against my ribs. I followed Arthur's advice, letting them tire each other out. The price climbed, then stalled. "Do I hear 30,000 more?" The auctioneer boomed. Silence. Going once. I lifted my paddle. Number 7. My voice was clear and steady, louder than I expected. Yes. A few heads turned. One of the sharks, a man with slicked back hair, looked me over, a dismissive smirk on his face. He upped the bid. I immediately countered. We went back and forth, the price climbing higher. This was the moment of truth. My palms were sweating, but I kept my face placid, my gaze fixed on the auctioneer. I would not be intimidated. This man saw me as an old lady playing games. He had no idea he was bidding against 40 years of betrayed love and a mother's iron will. Finally he shook his head, a gesture of disgust, and backed down. Sold. The auctioneer yelled, his gavel cracking through the still air. To bidder number 7. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I had done it. I owned my son's house. I walked numbly to the clerk's table, signed the initial paperwork, and arranged for the cashier's check from the fund Ms. Albright had prepared. As I walked away from the courthouse steps, a light drizzle began to fall. I didn't mind. It felt like the world was washing itself clean. 2 weeks later, I did it again. Lisa's house was a smaller, newer model in a cookie-cutter development. The process was almost identical. A few bidders, a short, sharp battle, and the final beautiful crack of the gavel. I now owned the roof over my daughter's head as well. I went home with the deeds to both of their lives tucked safely in my briefcase. I sat at my kitchen table and spread the documents out. My name, Margaret Collins, was listed as the new owner. It was a strange, surreal feeling. I felt no joy, no triumphant glee. Just a quiet, profound sense of order being restored. I knew they wouldn't find out right away. The legal process would take a few weeks to finalize. They would get a notice of eviction from the bank, and then, a formal introduction to their new landlord. To me, the plan was in motion. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the phone to ring. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that it would. Part 4, The Rent is Due. The silence after the auctions was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the lonely, aching silence of the year before. It was the charged, humming silence of a mousetrap, perfectly set and waiting. I went about my days with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I tended my roses, which were just beginning to bud, their tight green fists promising a riot of color to come. I drank my coffee on the porch swing. I was at peace. The architect, having completed her blueprint, was now simply waiting for the new tenants to be informed of their change in circumstance. The first call came from Lisa, exactly 3 weeks after I'd bought her house. It was a Tuesday. I was kneading dough for a loaf of bread, my hands covered in flour, when the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I had a feeling. I cleaned my hands, took a deep, steadying breath, and answered. Hello. A choked, hysterical sob came from the other end. Mom? Oh God, Mom, is that you? It was Lisa. Her voice was thin and ragged with panic. Yes, Lisa. It's me. I kept my own voice placid, calm. The voice of a stranger taking a business call. Mom, you won't believe what's happening, she wailed. We got a notice. From the bank. They sold the house. We're being evicted. We have 30 days to get out. We have nowhere to go. The kids. Oh God, the kids. I let her spiral, the wave of her panic washing over the phone line. She was expecting me to rush in, to play the role of the forgiving mother, the rescuer. She was expecting me to offer her my guest room, my savings, my sympathy. She had forgotten that she and her brother had burned that bridge and salted the earth behind them. You won't have to go anywhere, Lisa, I said into the torrent of her tears. Her sobbing hitched, then stopped. What? What do you mean? I mean you'll be staying right where you are. A beat of confused silence. I don't understand. The notice says the house was sold to a private investor. Her voice trailed off as the pieces began to click into place in her mind. The timing. The fact that I had answered her call. The chilling calm in my voice. I could almost hear the gears grinding, the dawning, horrified realization. Who bought the house, Mom? She whispered, her voice trembling with a new kind of fear, one that had nothing to do with homelessness. I did, dear, I said, and the words were as gentle as a pat on the head and as sharp as a shard of glass. I bought it at the foreclosure auction. I'm the private investor. I'll be sending over the new lease agreement tomorrow. Rent is due on the 1st of the month. Don't be late. I heard a sound like a gasp, a struggle for air, and then the line went dead. I hung up the phone and looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady. I went back to kneading my bread. Daniel didn't call. He was too proud, too arrogant for that. He showed up. Less than an hour after Lisa's call, she must have called him immediately, hysterically. His car once again tore into my driveway, spraying gravel. This time, however, when he pounded on my door, I didn't open it right away. I let him stand there, fuming on my porch, for a full minute before I turned the lock. He looked wild. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie was askew, and his face was a mottled, unhealthy red. He looked like the man I'd seen in the grocery store. a man whose world was built on a foundation of lies and was now collapsing in on him. You, he seethed, jabbing a finger at my face. This was you. You bought my house. Yes, I did, I said, not moving from the doorway. I would not let him inside my home. He had forfeited that right forever. How could you do this to us? To your own family? This is insane. It's evil, he sputtered, searching for a word big enough to contain his outrage. I looked him straight in the eye, my gaze as cool and unyielding as a winter sky. Let me make sure I understand, Daniel. When you and your sister forged my signature to sell my house out from under me so you could pay for your mistakes, that was just helping me downsize. But when I use my own, legally obtained money to purchase your foreclosed property in a public auction, that's evil? I let the question hang in the air. Your hypocrisy is breathtaking. He was speechless. For the first time in his life, Daniel Collins, the smooth talker, the man with all the answers, had absolutely nothing to say. He just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Actions have consequences, Daniel, I continued, my voice low and even. You tried to steal from me. You tried to take the one thing your father and I built together. You saw this house not as a home, but as an asset. Well, I've simply learned the lesson you tried to teach me. Your house is now my asset. Your sister's house is my asset. You will receive a lease agreement, just like she will. You will pay your rent on time. If you are late, you will be charged a late fee. If you fail to pay, I will begin the eviction process. Do you understand me? We're your children. He finally managed to roar, his voice cracking with desperation. And you were my children when you stood in this very spot and called me selfish for wanting to keep my own home, I replied without missing a beat. That word doesn't seem to hold the power you think it does anymore. Now, unless you have something productive to say, get off my property. He stood there for another moment, his chest heaving, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Rage, disbelief, and underneath it all, a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear. He had lost control. He had always been able to manage me, to manipulate me, but that woman was gone. In her place was a stranger he didn't recognize, a woman who owned him. He turned without another word, stormed back to his car, and sped away. The lease agreements went out the next day via certified mail. They were standard, ironclad documents drafted by Arthur. They detailed the monthly rent, which I had set at fair market value, the security deposit, the rules regarding property maintenance, everything. There was nothing personal in them. It was pure business. The first of the month arrived. I wondered if they would do it. If pride, or foolish defiance, would make them refuse. But where would they go? Their credit was shot. No one would rent to them. They were trapped. Lisa's check arrived in the mail on the 1st, tucked into an unsigned greeting card. Daniel's arrived on the 3rd. He had waited, a petty act of resistance. I went to my bank and calmly deposited the checks, then sent him a formal typed notice that he had incurred a $50 late fee, as per the terms of his lease, which would be added to next month's rent. And so our new reality began. Every 30 days, my 2 children, the ones who had considered me a burden, had to ensure that a significant portion of their income was transferred to me. They were paying for the privilege of living in the houses that their own irresponsibility had cost them. They were, in essence, paying me back for the life they had tried to steal. The neighborhood, of course, noticed. Whispers followed me at the grocery store. Mary, my gossip-prone neighbor, called under the pretense of asking for a scone recipe, her voice dripping with curiosity. I offered no explanations. I simply smiled, talked about the weather, and watered my roses. Let them whisper. Their opinions were irrelevant. The revenge wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, monotonous, and unending. It was the monthly arrival of their checks. It was the formal, impersonal emails I sent regarding lawn maintenance or a leaky faucet. When a pipe burst under Lisa's sink 2 months in, she called me, frantic. I didn't rush over with old towels. I calmly told her I would call a plumber and that he would be there between noon and 4. Then I sent her a bill for the service call, as the lease stipulated she was responsible for minor plumbing issues. She and Daniel had tried to turn my home into a transaction. I had simply returned the favor. They wanted to live in a world of assets and liabilities, of profits and losses. I was now their creditor. And the rent was always due. It's been a year now since I became a landlord to my own children. Nothing has fundamentally changed between us. There have been no apologies, no tearful reunions. The chasm they opened with their greed and betrayal is too wide to be bridged. Daniel is sullen and resentful. His checks always arrive on the last possible day. Lisa sometimes includes a passive-aggressive note with her payment, or a school photo of my grandchildren. A clumsy, transparent attempt at emotional blackmail that no longer works on me. I mail the photos back. I am not a cruel woman. I ensure the properties are maintained. When the furnace in Daniel's house died last winter, I had it replaced with a top-of-the-line model within 2 days. I am a good landlord. I am a responsible property owner. But I am not their mother anymore. Not in the way I was. That woman died in the county records office, staring at a forged signature. Sometimes, when I'm out on my porch swing in the evenings, watching the fireflies begin to dot the twilight air, I wonder if they've learned anything. Not just about money, but about value. About the difference between a house and a home. About the price of respect. I don't know if they have. Perhaps they never will. But I know what I have learned. I've learned that I am stronger than I ever imagined. I learned that the end of one story is often just the beginning of another. My children tried to write me out of my own life, to put a for sale sign on my past and my future. They thought I was a fragile old woman, a relic to be cleared away. But they were wrong. I am the foundation. I am the walls. I am the roof that has weathered every storm. This little blue house taught me how to stand my ground. And in the end, the woman who built their home didn't just teach them a lesson. She ended up owning theirs. And every month when they pay their rent, they are reminded not of my weakness, but of my strength. They are reminded that you should never, ever, try to steal from the person who holds the pen. Because she will always get to write the final chapter. Thank you for listening to my story. It's not a happy one, but it's a real one. And it's mine. If you've ever had to find your own strength in the face of betrayal, I see you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, not about my children, but about the nature of justice itself. What does it mean to finally get what you deserve? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the long, slow, and satisfying road to vindication. Until next time, take care of yourselves and your homes.